So now we're going to talk about the process of ovum maturation. So let's try to get familiar with the terminology here. We are in the ovary. So the eggs that are in there, they are called, or this one here, for example, is called a primordial follicle. And it can turn into a baby, but until then, it needs to mature. And it lives in the ovary. So how does it mature? It turns into primary follicle, then into a secondary follicle, then into a graphene follicle, and during ovulation, the oocyte leaves, so that's the secondary follicle, leaves the graphene follicle. It goes into the fallopian tube here and waits for the sperm and leaves something behind in the ovary, and that's called the corpus luteum, which then will degenerate when no fertilization takes place. So when you've watched the video how the 4 hormones interact during the menstrual cycle, you will now understand why it has several peaks and why the hormones are high or low. Now, we look at the cycle in the ovary during the menstrual cycle. So let's start again with the hypothalamus. Do you remember? So here we've got the hypothalamus, and in the anterior pituitary there are these cells called gonadotropin. And these gonadotropin, once they stimulated, they secrete 2 chemicals into the bloodstream. One is called FSH and the other LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. They will be soon on their way down to the ovary, but before they do that, we need to discuss the process of the ovum maturation. That is the process from the primordial follicle to a primary follicle, secondary follicle, graphene follicle, and finally corpus luteum. So we will go through 3 phases: the follicular phase, ovulation, and after that it's called luteal phase. So let's start with phase 1 from day 1 to 14. This is called the follicular phase. So first, our little ovum or egg is called a primordial follicle. This will be our egg soon. But how does this primordial follicle become an ovum? So from the beginning, what's this called? A primordial follicle. So this primordial follicle is still diploid. When is this occurring? During childhood. So when is this occurring? Yes, pre-puberty. Once the female reaches puberty, she starts undergoing the specific ovulatory cycles. So when does this start? Yes, when she hits puberty. And what follicles does she have? All her primordial follicles that she will ever need. So she has tons and tons of, what are they called again? Primordial follicles. But then look what happens. once she hits puberty, these primordial follicles at puberty get stimulated. Yes, this time not by FSH or LH, by androgens, but it's not so important. Okay, so we get to pre-puberty, all the way to this follicle, which is a primordial follicle. One more time, what's this called? A primordial follicle. This diploid is actually frozen in a specific step of what's called meiosis. It's actually frozen specifically in prophase. I will explain in a different video what meiosis is specifically here, so if you've forgotten. So how would you describe a primordial follicle before we go on to the secondary follicle and then to the graphene follicle? So a primary oocyte. So first of all, a primordial follicle is a primary oocyte. So in there, this little dot is the primary oocyte, which means it hasn't undergone meiosis 1 and it's still frozen in prophase. It has a single layer around it, so that's why you see it's a single layer. It's not like here, it's got a little bit more layers, and that's why it's called a primordial follicle. Okay, in the next step, it starts proliferating. Do you see all these lovely cells around? It makes multiple types of, they're called granulosa cells. They are cuboid, as you can see, like a column. Now, this is called a secondary follicle. And one hormone is very critical for this step. It is called FSH. And so a primordial follicle turns into a secondary follicle. So it turns into what? It gets converted into a secondary follicle. And how? Yes, FSH is stimulating this step. It comes from so FSH comes from where? Do you remember? It comes from the pituitary gland down, all the way down to the ovary. And yes, and these cells here underwent proliferation. So that is called mitosis, because the granulosa cells here, these little pink thingies here, they make multiple layers. You can see there are lots of layers. And what else happens? So FSH also stimulates this oocyte to produce glycoprotein membrane. It's called the zona pellucida. Don't worry. But what comes out of this process? They are producing a hormone. Yes, and this hormone is called the female hormone estrogen. Not only FSH is involved in this process. Yes, as you can probably guess, it's also LH. So around these follicles, there are just, so this is just for you to know, this is not that important. LH exactly is acting on the thecal cells. These thecal cells are taking cholesterol and converting it into androgens. And then these androgens move into the thecal cells and get converted into estrogen. So just for you to know, this is quite a complicated process, but what we need to know is that who's stimulating this mechanism? So that's in general is the job of the FSH. So FSH is stimulating what? The conversion into estrogen. So FSH is stimulating the production of estrogen. That's the most important thing that we have to learn here. FSH also starts telling these cells to start producing follicular fluid. As you can see, there are little holes here, and that's the follicular fluid. So what is follicular fluid? I mean, look at the fluid. It's hyaluronic acid. And it's not only causing, again, the proliferation of these cells. You see that they got even more. And not only causing the production of estrogen, it's also causing them to produce follicular fluid. So now we produce these pockets of follicular fluid. Who's responsible for these fat pockets of follicular fluid? Yes, FSH. So what again is FSH doing? It's causing multiple layers of these granulosa cells. And we are also making more of these cells. And what else? They are producing pockets of follicular fluid. And what hormone is produced? What female hormone? Estrogen. So LH is also stimulating the cells to produce estrogen. It is called a secondary follicle because you can tell, because it has more layers of pockets of follicular fluid. Now it is going to get even more stimulated from which hormones? FSH and LH. So FSH is going to continue what? To do what? Yes, the proliferation of the cells and the pockets of the follicular fluid. And what's the result of this? You produce more estrogen. LH is also stimulating these cells. And what happens now to the fluid? Look here. These little pockets of follicular fluid will fill up until eventually these little pockets come all together and make a big fluid-filled cavity. So what is this big cavity filled? With follicular fluid. It looks like, a lake of follicular fluid, It's also called the antrum. What happens next? So, in the next step, our secondary follicle, so all of these little steps in between, they're all called the secondary follicle, turn into a so-called Graafian follicle. This secondary follicle undergoes meiosis 1 and produces haploid daughter cells, and then it can undergo meiosis 2. So this Graafian follicle is the secondary oocyte frozen in metaphase 2. So the Graafian follicle is a secondary oocyte, and it already underwent meiosis 1. It's ready to undergo meiosis 2. Very good. So you can see two peaks in estrogen during the follicular phase, that is until day 14. So we're still here. We haven't moved anywhere else. Why is that? And now you understand why estrogen and so on rises. So you remember, when did we say estrogen is rising? It's not during the primordial follicle, do you remember? Doesn't produce estrogen yet. When does it produce it? Very good. During the secondary, when it's called a secondary follicle. And it's around produced, somewhere in the middle, so during these phase. And estrogen is going into the bloodstream, into the hypothalamus, and then into the anterior pituitary, and it exerts a negative feedback. So I know it says estradiol, but that's another form of estrogen. So just think this is called estrogen. So it comes from the ovary, exerts a negative feedback here in the pituitary, and so when are your estrogen levels rising? Do you remember? It's not at the beginning. It's somewhere in the middle of so about day 7. We're still before ovulation, which is the middle of our whole cycle. I mean, in the middle of the follicular stage. So estrogen goes from the bloodstream to the hypothalamus and then into the anterior pituitary, and it inhibits the hypothalamus from secreting gonadotropin. As a consequence, it also inhibits the anterior pituitary from releasing FSH and LH. Because of that, the production of estrogen is going to drop a little, as you can see here. It's going to drop a little and go up, and drop a little and go up. Because of that, positive of this negative feedback cycle, it says no stop, no go up, no stop, no go up, no stop, and so on. So because of that, the production of estrogen is going to drop, as we said, but it's going to go to increase again to very high levels around day 14, so at the middle of our whole menstrual cycle and at the end of our follicular phase. And then at the end of so how does this happen? If it always goes up and down, like how can it rise so high? Well, it does something very funny. So at the end of the follicular phase, something strange happens near ovulation, so near mid-cycle. Estrogen stimulates the hypothalamus to produce tons of gonadotropin. It stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce tons of LH. Now you noticed I didn't say FSH. Why? Because the Graafian follicle is so special. Whenever you get to the end of the follicular phase, it notices the rise of estrogen and it produces a blocker called inhibin. And inhibin comes also into the anterior pituitary from releasing FSH. So the Graafian follicle notices the high amount of estrogen and releases this inhibin, which inhibits the anterior pituitary from releasing FSH. So before estrogen was promoting, remember, a negative feedback. But towards the end of the follicular phase, so when our ovulation is going to happen, it is promoting a positive feedback mechanism to stimulate the hypothalamus to release tons and tons of gonadotropin, to stimulate the pituitary to produce, tons and tons of LH. Now that FSH is suppressed, inhibited, you can see that FSH is, it's not going to go anywhere. But we can see a surge, boom, in LH. Yes, of course, because we already said we're going to produce tons of LH. So that is called the LH surge. And that has to do with our Graafian follicle. The Graafian follicle is responsible for that. It increases the actual blood flow and permeability and produces a lot of follicular fluid, and it activates a special enzyme that acts like a scissor as well. These are the proteases. And they start eating away around the tissue. So they go breaking down the tissue. And I know that this looks very much 2D, but you have to think of this as a 3D model. And if you know, if these scissors eat their way through the ground, you're kind of popped out of this thing, out of the Graafian follicle. You know, that's exactly at day 14, our ovulation. So literally this egg pops out of the Graafian follicle. That's why it might also, you know, gives you a little sting, you know, because it's not really nice when it you have to think of it. It doesn't push itself out. It really gets like cut out, and it's, you know, this oocyte now leaves the Graafian follicle, and it's still frozen in metaphase 2. So now we have, as you can see, we are now in a different phase. We are in now, it's called ovulation. We are exactly in day 14. You know, here we have tons of LH. Estrogen is still very high as well, and maintaining LH as well, because estrogen is the cause why LH is that high. And we have this little oocyte that is leaving the Graafian follicle behind. It's frozen in metaphase 2. So day 14 is called the ovulatory phase. This is obvious because this is when our ovulation takes place. So in the middle of our cycle, so that's at day 14. This phase is triggered by the LH surge. We have an oocyte that left the Graafian follicle, and it's frozen in metaphase 2. It's more or less lost, you know. So, you know, it left its home and it needs a new home. Who's going to find it? It's the little fingers, or the fimbriae, of the fallopian tube. As you can see, you know, they really start scraping, it's quite interesting, across the surface of the ovary. So like they create a scar, and that these creates, you know, that's why it's also quite hurtful as well for some women. And it creates little fluid-filled currents, like a little river. And these rivers, you know, they push that little oocyte towards the fallopian tubes. And you know, so that these little fingers, they catch the secondary oocyte, you know, just that one little thingy, you know, that popped, not the whole stuff, frozen in metaphase 2. And once it is caught, it undergoes a beating mechanism. These you know, these columnar cells here, you know, these fingers, they have cilia on their surface that beat, you know. So they're really pushing that little oocyte towards the fallopian tube, called the ampulla, and it keeps it there until the sperm cells comes to fertilize it. So again, during ovulation, so the Graafian follicle ejects the secondary oocyte out into the fallopian tube. That's what you have to remember. Now let's go into our last phase. It is called, this here, is called the luteal phase. Don't worry, it won't be as complicated as our first follicular phase. So this is now from day 15 to day 28. Once the oocyte left the Graafian follicle, you know, what is left? It gets filled with blood. LH is going to differentiate them and specialize them, you know, so we still have this LH here. They start, if you want to know, they start accumulating a lot of lipids, a lot of cholesterol, so a lot of fat, and it's going to turn yellow, because fat is yellow. And lutea is another word for yellow. So hence it's called the corpus luteum. Isn't that nice? So the Graafian follicle now turns actually into like a hormone producing factory called the corpus luteum. So produce lots of hormones. What's it called? The corpus luteum. And who triggers that? LH. Triggers the conversion of the Graafian follicle that ruptured into the corpus luteum. So the LH is stimulating the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum produces a hormone called, what do you see rising here? Yes, progesterone. And now you know why. These levels are rising and so on. So we have ovulation here. We have the empty follicle, like the house. The egg left this house. We don't need it anymore. It's gonna degenerate, especially if the egg is not fertilized. And we have the corpus luteum here, which is a producing factory of hormones. And in the luteal phase, again, we have a new hormone. It's not estrogen anymore. As you know, it's progesterone, exerting a negative feedback cycle to the anterior pituitary gland. So that's the whole cycle. Congratulations! So let's recap. What is this one called again? A primordial follicle. Very good. What is this one called? A secondary follicle. And what's this one called? A Graafian follicle. Then what takes place? Ovulation. And what is left? The corpus luteum. The first phase from day 1 to 14 is called the follicular phase. Very good. What happens in the follicular phase? So, what's in there, that little dot? What kind of oocyte? Yes, it's a primary oocyte in a primordial follicle, and then it turns into a secondary oocyte in the secondary follicle, and it has all around multiple layers, and here follicular fluid. Very good. So there are two hormones here, FSH and LH. They are producing a female hormone called estrogen. So before, estrogen was promoting a negative feedback, but towards the end of the follicular phase, in our Graafian follicle, it's promoting a positive feedback mechanism to stimulate the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin and to stimulate the pituitary to produce tons of what hormone? LH. That's called the LH surge. That's at day 14. It pops out of the Graafian follicle. This oocyte now leaves the Graafian follicle, and it is still frozen in what stage? Metaphase 2. So day 14 is also called the ovulatory phase. It is in the middle of our cycle, so this is at day 14. This phase is triggered by the LH surge. We have an oocyte that left the Graafian follicle. During ovulation, it ejects the what oocyte? The secondary oocyte out into the, where does it go, this egg? The fallopian tube. What's the name of our last phase? The luteal phase. So that's from day 15 to day 28. LH triggers the conversion of the Graafian follicle into the corpus luteum. The LH is then stimulating the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum produces a hormone called progesterone. Very good. If you knew all of these answers, go and watch the next video.